attack. Well, you got to start the discussion somewhere about how we're going to get this government on a sustainable course. I mean, I voted for Bowles, Simpson Bowles. I voted for Ryan's budget. I voted for the Republican Study Committee budget. Let's have the discussion somewhere. But if the Senate won't take up a budget, then we're not going to be able to have that discussion. And that's why the American people now will suffer through more continuing resolutions, and we as a nation don't have a budget. And every person in this room, whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal, a conservative, a progressive, you ought to be incensed that the Senate does not take up the budget. That is a dereliction of their duty, and they ought to be voting on a budget so the United States of America has a spending plan. And so we can create certainty, and we can create funding sources and all of the things that the federal government does, but they don't take up the budget. But you are absolutely right. Medicare is cut by $500 billion in the Affordable Care Act, and the creation of the IPF board should be of concern to every senior. Thank you for the question.
Benefits.
Josephine. We have a long question here. Is Josephine here? Would you like to read your question, or would you like me to read that?
4/24/10. Executive Order 13535, President Obama provided that the standard restructuring of the Hyde Amendment were restated under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and extended to also include and cover insurance exchanges and the churches. The Weldon Amendment, Section 508 Public Law, which remains intact, gave new protections to prohibit discrimination against healthcare facilities, providers, because of unwillingness by conscience to provide pay or provide coverage or refer for abortion. How does this executive order, specifically the Weldon Amendment, which stipulated that the church by conscience were protected from exactly what is now in the HHS mandate?
What Joe is talking about is the HHS mandate, which goes into effect August the 1st of 2012, and it should be of concern to everyone who believes that there is a First Amendment to the Constitution that guarantees us freedom of religion. Because the HHS mandate requires that we violate our conscience, that a healthcare provider or an employee or employer or anyone providing, if a college has, Catholic college or a Christian college has a healthcare plan, which we know many of them have dropped their coverage of their students, and the plan that they would have to be required to refer for sterilization for abortifacient drugs. And so the HHS mandate is of concern, and as you know, many churches, Catholic, evangelical, Jewish faith, are all very concerned about the ramifications of this law. And it does go into effect August the 1st. I think it probably is one of the largest assaults on our religious freedom and our Constitution in the history of the country. And I think every American should be concerned. It's not a Catholic issue. It's not a contraceptive issue. It is the right to religious freedom. It's a First Amendment constitutional issue. And it goes into effect unless something else is wrong. Thanks for your question.
Janine from Syracuse. What will you do to protect unborn babies? Would you support a law that specifies anyone with unique human DNA as legal human?
I don't know the last part of your question. I don't know if you're referring to a specific bill.
Oh, no, whatever comes.
I think it's no surprise to anyone that I believe that life begins at conception, and that when we talk about our Declaration of Independence and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that includes the unborn. And we as a nation, a civilized nation, need to protect everyone, from the life of conception, from the time of conception until the time of natural death. And I include in there our most vulnerable, our handicapped, our seniors. We get on a slippery slope where we're not protecting life, and when life isn't valuable, then we run the risk of no life being valuable. So thank you for your question.
Mark from Cicero. Assuming the Senate does not vote to repeal Obamacare, what is the next step and what is essential in the replacement bill to ensure it is not economically damaging?
Well, we don't know what the Senate's going to do, and it'll be interesting to see if they're willing to take it up. But I would guarantee that even if the Senate does vote to repeal it, it won't be signed into law by the White House, and I'm going to just go out on a limb there. But I think, one of the things we didn't mention today is the court ruled, number one, that Congress could tax, that the law was constitutional because they could tax and levy a tax. But the other part of the court's decision, I think, is equally as important, because Chief Justice John Roberts said that the federal government cannot punish the states if they are unwilling to expand their Medicaid programs pursuant to the Affordable Care Act. And so many Republican states, many Democratic states, we've heard complaints from them. We know here in our own county, in our own state, if you talk to Joni Mahoney, the unfunded mandate of Medicaid and what it does to the cost for the county and for their budget. So I think you're going to see some pushback from various states. And in fact, 26 states participated in the lawsuit against HHS, saying we cannot fund, we can't afford to expand Medicaid by 14 million Americans. And the estimate's been somewhere from 14 to 20 million Americans. So what you're going to see then is if Medicaid isn't expanded, people cannot get on Medicaid coverage because the state chooses not to, because it's now the court said it's their right, those folks are going to go into the exchange. They're going to have to deal with private insurers, and that's going to drive up the cost of this Affordable Care Act even more. And if you look at the CBO's website, they say that they're actually right now, because of that piece of the Supreme Court's decision, they're now recalculating the cost of this health care. The health care law is estimated to cost this country $1.076 trillion over 10 years. It is going to be a deficit. It's going to cost the country money. It cannot sustain itself. And I don't know how many have ever looked at a government program, but when the government says it's going to cost $1 trillion over 10 years, you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to cost way beyond that. And I as someone who's been involved in healthcare most of my professional life, I feel very passionate about it. I had a sister who was significantly disabled. I get that piece. I have a mother who's 91. I understand the Medicare piece. But for anyone who's operated and watched the government operate, the government, because of what it is, operates least efficiently and most expensively. That's just the reality of the bureaucracy. And so when we talk about the healthcare law, we ought to be concerned as we create more bureaucracies. Less money goes into the healthcare system, less money goes into affordable care for those who need it, and more goes into feeding the bureaucracy and feeding the many agencies that will be created as a result of this law. So right now we're talking about it costing $1 trillion over 10 years. I think that this piece with the Medicaid and the states don't have to comply with the Medicaid in expanding their programs is of concern because it's going to drive the cost of this affordable care and people.
Charlie.
From East Syracuse. Do you want me to read it? Or
Oh, you can read it.
Okay. Do you have any idea when
The Chief Law Enforcement
officer
of the United States
is going to abide by the rulings of the Chief Grand Jury of the United
States? Good.
Thank you for your question, and that certainly was something that came up last week, was the contempt vote. There are actually two contempt votes holding Eric Holder in contempt of Congress for his failure to hand over the documents that were subpoenaed way back in the beginning of 2011. I think that for those who think that this was a gleeful process or a political process, that was not the mood down in Washington. And ultimately, there were 17 Democrats who voted to hold the Attorney General in contempt as well. And it isn't to say that the Attorney General is guilty of something. It is just to say, hand over the documents, and he's the head of the Department of Justice, so we can see who is responsible, so we can see what happened, so we can see how a Border Patrol agent was killed with 2 American weapons found by his body, so we can tell why 200 plus innocent Mexican lives were killed as a part of this Fast and Furious, and do what the Oversight Government Reform Committee does. You oversee, you look at, you investigate, and then you reform to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Now, Eric Holder was in front of the committee. We had the whistleblowers in front of the committee. We had Brian Terry's family in front of the committee. So we've spent a lot of time on this, but I will tell you that when DOJ sent a letter to Senator Grassley and said DOJ has no knowledge of Fast and Furious, and then it took them several months later to say, oh yes, we do have knowledge of Fast and Furious, that sent up a lot of red flags, because it was very unsettling. The Department of Justice either misrepresented itself in that letter or didn't have knowledge about it, and they should have had knowledge given the extent of and the damages that were created by Fast and Furious. The other piece is, and you hear this a lot, is that, well, George Bush had Wide Receiver. He did have a program called Wide Receiver. The difference was that Wide Receiver had GPS tracking devices in the guns. And once, of course, the gun traffickers realized that they were there, they would take them out and then let the guns walk. And so once the administration realized that, they discontinued Wide Receiver. So some will say, well, it just is a continuation of what George Bush started. That program was discontinued, and then Fast and Furious was a new program. But as you know, the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia said he would not hold Eric Holder criminally contempt. Now the civil contempt will go forward. That probably will go to a lower court, and the court can compel the Attorney General and the Department of Justice to hand over the requested documents. We'll see what happens with that.
Trudy Butler, Syracuse.
Will you read your question? How can they claim that this is a tax for not buying insurance? My understanding of taxes is that you pay it on goods or services bought. I have never paid taxes on something I didn't buy.
Trudy, that's a great question, and really what the court held in this case is that the government can now tax inactivity. So that's a pretty big door that was just opened and should be of concern to every American. And I've had people say, well, what about car insurance? We're mandated to buy car insurance. Well, car insurance, you're mandated to buy car insurance when you make the decision to own a car and to drive that car. When you want to practice law, you have to take a bar exam. When you want to cut someone's hair, you get a barber's license. So that's based, those are licenses and fees and whatever you want to call them, some would say taxes, on an action. This is the first time the court has said it's okay to tax inactivity, and that should be of concern to everyone. That's a great question.
Betty, Jamesville. Read the question. Why are you so right-wing if you represent a moderate district?
Well, I guess I would ask what you would call right-wing and what you're referring to when you ask me that question, and you're welcome to answer that right now, or we can talk afterwards.
Well, I had thought about, asking you a question relating to the Affordable Care Act, or Fast and Furious, or women's health, but I felt that the question I asked encompassed them all, and it just seems that if we looked at your voting record and your exchanges with Eric Holder in Congress, you are to the right of most of your constituency. I know that you won the election by a small majority, and I don't know how you rationalize your point of view when you're representing all of us.
Not for the right thing. Right?
Well, I think if you look at Eric Holder and you look at Fast and Furious, there's bipartisan support, so that doesn't seem like it's just a right-wing ideologue kind of position. I was the one who went to leadership and said we need a VAWA Act in the House of Representatives. We put forth a VAWA bill that funds violence against women more than the president had in his budget. We're working hard. It's a conference right now. The Senate has their bill. We have our bill. I've been very active in human trafficking issues. We just had a hearing down in Washington not too long ago. I think what's unfortunate, and I will say this with Paul in the room, is that the Post-Standard doesn't choose to cover a lot of the things I need. I understand there's maybe a limit with reporters, there's a limit with resources. I don't know what the reason is. But we're doing an awful lot of good things. We just passed in the House on Friday the transportation bill. That was bipartisan support to make sure that the companies here in upstate New York can have money for their roads and bridges and their infrastructure projects. There's a lot of good things going on. All of the things we do with the veterans. You know, I mentioned the one conference. We've actually had 2 conferences. There wasn't one mention of those in the paper. You know, to let the community know what we're doing. You know, I understand that not everyone is with me, but I mentioned earlier, you know, that doesn't believe as firmly as I do, but I think as a congressman, I take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and I take that very seriously. So when the First Amendment, right to religious freedom, is in jeopardy, I speak out. When we talk about the role of government, I mean, they're really, you can look in the Constitution, but I don't think you're going to find a right to health care in the Constitution. Now, as a nation, and as a country, and as a community, we want to make sure everyone so I took an oath, and I take that oath very seriously. But the other part of that is, when I ran, I was extremely honest with folks about what I stand for. And I said we would be open and accessible, accountable, and independent. I stood against leadership. I voted against the Budget Control Act because that was a bad bill. I think this nation needs to have a balanced budget. We owe that to our kids and our grandkids. And I'd be happy to have the conversation more, but I think it's easy to paint me because that's how I am portrayed. But in fact, we have done so many, you know, I introduced legislation and it was passed out of the House, I can't get the Senate to take it up, about sexual assaults in the military. It's a big problem. You know, we've had more hearings in Washington about veterans, about suicide, about their PTSD. But, you know, unless we write letters or we let everyone know, it's difficult we constantly fight that battle about getting back the information about all the things we're doing that interest everybody. Because, you know, there's an awful lot of common ground. There's an awful lot of common ground. There are a lot of needs that this country and issues that this country faces that it isn't a Democratic or Republican issue. That we as a nation have to come together and solve those. And I think the most pressing one is our debt and our deficit, because this nation is on the verge of bankruptcy, or if not bankrupt. And number 2, the economy and jobs. We have got to get this economy going. And when I see an article like this with the Affordable Care Act, with the excise tax, what it's going to do to Welsh Allen, who's a major employer in this district, good jobs, and a great, you know, and Eric Allen talks about this tax, this excise tax, is not going to apply if you do your business overseas. So how enticing is that for a company to leave upstate and go over? So when I'm against the Affordable Care Act, it's because I see what it does to business, I see what it does to hospitals, I see what it does to physicians. We met with the Onondaga County Medical Society the other night, and there's going to be such a shortage of primary care doctors, and doctors who won't take Medicare patients, and doctors who won't take Medicaid patients. They'll be taking self-pay patients because they can't run an office based on the reimbursements that Medicare or Medicaid gives to them. They can't, you know, it doesn't cover their costs. And so I look at this like ideologically, on some levels. But most of the way I look at it is practically, and I know for the last 18 months, what I've heard from businesses and hospitals and doctors, and I say, gee, maybe the intent was good, but we sure didn't get the right product. We need to go back and we need to continue to work on this as a nation. And we will be having hearing sessions so people can come in and talk to us about how do you want healthcare to look? What do you want to see? And have that debate and the discussion. Thank you so much.
Jane in Manlius. Jane here, would you like me to read your question? All right. Women's issues, the economy, and women's issues and the economy. Why do you not support equal pay for equal work? Lilly Ledbetter Act, the economy. What job bills are you supporting? And why are you not for the fair tax policies?
There's a lot of questions in that. Fair taxes, you mean fair taxes like no income tax, just fair tax. I see my fair tax expert in the back. Did you tell her to ask this question? With regards to employment and women have been unduly hit with this unemployment, the rate of unemployment. I think that as a nation, we need to get everyone back to work. I don't know, some women choose to work part-time and stay home, but I think as a nation, our job should be, and our goal should be, to get this economy back on its feet, to create policies that allow the government to get out of the way so businesses and women who want to go into business can be successful. Now, not too long ago, WISE, which is a Women Igniting Entrepreneurial Spirit, it's a women's group, and they had an event down at Beyond Center. Did anybody know about that event? There were 1,000 people there that morning, women creating businesses. It was so exciting. I don't think we do a good enough job, and I hate to single out Paul because he's the only one here, but the media doesn't allow people to know what's going on here in the community. Now that was a great event. It was so exciting, all these women, small business owners getting started, a good exchange of ideas, and the community doesn't know about it. There are a lot of initiatives in the House. We've taken up several jobs bills, and I have a list of them here that you're welcome to look at. But we're stymied because the Senate doesn't take up those bills. We're stymied because they just won't. And so all of the jobs to get rid of some of the regulations, to reduce burdens, tax burdens and regulatory burdens on businesses, the Keystone Pipeline, we can't get them to take that up. We can't get them to take up one of the things was repealing the regulations for drilling in the Gulf. There's been so many initiatives in the House. And I will say the House has made jobs in the economy their #1 issue. And we can't get the Senate to take those up. And when America prospers, women prosper. And I contend that we get this economy back on its feet and women do well, will do just as well as men.
Johnston Camillus. Would you have your question? You're ready.
It's hard to do both at the same time, but okay.
There's another track over here, so don't read them.
Anne Marie, can you hear me? No. This is on. Okay. Hello, anybody? Hello?
Yes?
Okay. I want to ask you about HR 5932.
You're calling it the Expand the Opportunity for Educational Savings Act.
And I
Would call it Anne Marie Berkel's
gift to rich taxpayers.
who want to send their kids to private school act. And it's asking the rest of the taxpayers to subsidize other
People who want to send their kids
tuition,
of other people who want to,
send their kids to private school.
you're asking the American taxpayers to subsidize this when you haven't agreed to charge any new taxes for anything. Why are you taxing the Americans to send wealthy kids to private schools?
Sorry, the mic issues, it's been very
HR 5932, I think, is a bill we're just getting about ready to introduce, or we dropped it last week. But it has to do with giving tax credits to folks who want to send their kids to private school or to a charter school, or to someone who wants to homeschool. I think the best thing we can do in this country, and Dana, you can quote me on this, is to create competition in our public education system. I'm such a believer in public education. I think that that's a legitimate role of the government, but they've not done a good job at it. They have squandered the money that we've put into the Department of Education, and we are not. I think it's a moral issue. I do, Dave. I think it's a moral issue, the failure of our kids coming out of our public schools. And I think it should be of concern to every American. What we need to do morally as a nation is to make sure our kids are competitive and equipped to take on not just national competition, but in an international marketplace. Well, I had a wonderful tour down at the Syracuse Academy down on Salina Street. Do you know what the waiting list is for kids who want to get to that charter school? There's hundreds of mothers and fathers who want to make the choice to put their kids in that charter school because of how they teach and what they're teaching. And I think every parent, especially those parents who are poor and who can't afford to send their kids to a private school, ought to have a choice. Ought to have a choice, Dana, not to be able to...
This program doesn't give them a choice because they don't have the kind of...
It increases competition. It's one more thing that we need to do.
Competition. It's subsidizing people who can't afford private school.
It
Subsidizing
Well, I have to pay a lot of
because they
tax
can't
money, my
save-
dad,
Excuse me,
and I
No.
can't
No one
go to private
interrupted
school.
you.
Stop, Dana, stop.
My
Please,
point is
please.
that
What we need to do
only
is...
goes to people who can afford to have savings accounts, not the people who earn under, I submit, a family under $50,000 a year income with at least 4 members of the family cannot afford a 529 account. 4 kids currently attending school, they're busy trying to save for college. So this is only going to help the wealthiest people who are paying private school tuition, not helping people in public charter schools because they're not paying tuition.
I think if you went to, oh, I don't care, I'll pick one, Bishop Ludden, CBA, you can pick any of the private schools in the area, you will find a lot of middle-class people there who make a tremendous sacrifice to send their child to a private school because the public schools don't give them what they need, whether it's values or science or math.
That's
So
their
that-
choice, that's their choice. We shouldn't have to subsidize their choice.
But they're subsidizing the public education,
That's the
and we can't afford.
So I think that the real debate...
I'm not a rich person,
You don't get
but
to
I
talk.
never,
Mrs. Emery,
I
we're
wanted
not
to send
here
my
to hear
kids
you.
to parochial schools, but
Sir,
I
we're not
couldn't
here to
afford
hear
to
you.
pay for
We're here to hear
two.
you.
I
You
couldn't
don't count.
afford to pay
You're
for
being
two
rude.
I think,
educational
okay,
systems.
I think we need
couldn't afford
to,
that. And what we should
You need
have
to talk
is
to
not
John,
only
sir.
that,
You're
but
out
we
of
should
turn,
have
sir.
vouchers,
You're out of turn.
and you get a choice.
You're speaking out of turn. Everybody's being polite for your point of view.
We've heard yours, too.
Yeah, we've heard yours.
No,
Public
she hasn't.
schools
She's
in
not
this
a-
I think I
country are
answered your
travesty.
question. Thank you.
Move on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scott from Dewitt. You want your question, all right?
You know, she already answered it in her opening statement, so I...
Supreme Court's decision for Obamacare.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Anne Marie.
Thanks for being here.
Stephanie, Syracuse, Fast and Furious.
Hi, would it be okay, I'm right here, would it be okay if I ask something having to do with the healthcare system instead? Would that be okay? Because that came up much more than the others come up, and I really, that's a concern of mine as well. Would that be all right?
Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'm from Syracuse. And I just wanted to, let's see, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, okay. You said that the government protects our rights as opposed to granting rights.
which I thought was
really great statement. But I look at the whole Obamacare thing, the whole healthcare thing, and the mandate as protecting our rights as individuals from diseases that should be out of existence in the world today but aren't. The strain of TB in China at this point that is uncurable. These are the sorts of things. I think that the mandate's all about the protection of individuals, not what you or I or whatever. We all deserve those protections as being part of the United States.
and I wondered if you would comment on that.
Well, I think in answer to part of your question with regards to programs, and I'm the congressional rep to the UN, and I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the programs that provide aid to other countries. And the United States is the kindest, most generous nation in the world, and they're very concerned, and as you know, and some would disagree, are providing health care and doing services for other countries when we, at home, we have Americans suffering. And so you'll hear a big debate on that. But in terms of that's a big leap to say that the mandate protects us from TB, and TB, there's treatment for TB now.
The point I'm trying to make is that we as individuals can't look at healthcare about who gets what or pays what or does what. It is something that many other countries have for every citizen. But the healthcare, you're protecting each of us from individuals who are sick or who carry clinical diseases and that sort of thing. And that to me is what the mandate's all about. And I just wondered.
I guess I'm not real clear on the question, but I would say that I don't understand how the mandate, we have those in place. I would be very concerned with in making sure that NIH and many of the other organizations who do research and development get the funds they need to continue to look for cures and to understand diseases better. But so many of those things are already in place in the United States of America. We have good health care.
But we have 42 people that don't have it that could contract things that come to a public hospital for care, or who pass you in the street, who can communicate these things to you. But that's what I'm looking at, is that the whole picture of everybody here, it's not about you and me and who's covered. There are so many, we all have to be covered so that we're all safe, as relative as safe as we can be.
So you're saying that everyone should have health insurance.
Right.
You agree with the mandate to protect us from those who don't have health care? I mean, there are so many safety nets. There's Medicaid,
But you
there's...
can walk into a hospital, demand care, and contagious, have a contagious disease affect everybody that's there. With bubonic plague in San Francisco, I don't know when that occurred, several years ago, people were stunned.
Yeah. The reality of it is, well, first of all, going back to how we started the whole discussion is the government not mandating, and certainly not mandating and then paying, the person having to pay a tax on inactivity, not getting health insurance. That sort of goes to the fundamental of what this country is about. I think that good public policy, the goal should be that we have health care coverage, that everyone, but the way we do that is not by the government mandating it. The way we do that is by making health insurance affordable, by making it available. And I would contend that when the government gets involved, and when the government is doing what they're doing, it drives the cost of health care up. And that's the unintended consequence of the Affordable Care Act. Our goal should be to have health policies that allow people to buy insurance across state lines. So there's competitive.
But the taxes you pay are less than you would pay for almost any insurance you would get. And you have to remember, guys, when you're paying for insurance, you can only buy insurance. Guys, we're only buying insurance from private providers, and they're the ones that are raising all of your rates.
Because they're being regulated.
They're raising their rates because the government has enacted law. Now think about this, when you're an insurance company and you're trying to figure out the cost. Under the Affordable Care Act, someone can choose not to have health care insurance, and then they go into the hospital, into the emergency room, and they have a very serious disease and they can get coverage. Now how does the health insurance company factor that in. They've got to increase their costs, so when that person walks into the emergency room and demands care and decides to get health insurance for that crisis, they've factored that in already. There's a cost involved with all of this. And that's the reality of what it's doing to the cost of healthcare has gone up since the Affordable Care Act has gone into effect. And the insurance companies, you know, pharma's been pretty safe. The administration made a deal with pharma at the beginning of the Affordable Care Act. But the insurance companies, they're trying to factor in what their risk is, and those costs are going to continue to go up. And it's a problem. But I think the better part is a public policy. I think we really need to keep the cost of healthcare down.
We all have to pay something for that. That's all.
Well, everybody does. Everyone pays taxes, and really, in this Affordable Care Act, as the court said, it is a tax that's going to affect middle-class America. 75% of the taxes paid because of the Affordable Care Act are going to be paid by those earning $120,000 and less. The court, Chief Justice Roberts said the only way we can find this constitutional is if we tax the American people. That's
But then those people that walk into the hospital will have to pay something, and that will take the cost of us who aren't there. Thank you.
One more question? Yeah, one more. From Bob in Dewitt. I'll read that. There was a Post-Standard article about CNY women leader.
there was an article, and I think it was in, I don't know, maybe Saturday's, Sunday's paper, and it was Sandra Smokes has a new radio show, and she invited in the females who held office or held that position for the first time. And I think Bob may be referring to the fact that I was omitted. And, you know, I don't know what to say about that. That's their choice, but it's
We're talking about important things like the hair.
I think what I find, and if I'm perfectly honest with all of you, I think what I find the most difficult thing to deal with is because of, you know, we talked about making sure women have equal opportunity. We talk about the American dream. We talk about advancing the cause of women, and we should do that as a nation. But what I find is